The key issue to my mind is that particularly the 90s, 80s and 90s, just when Indian economic growth picked up from the old 3% growth rate to 5.5% in the 80s and something like 6.5% in the 90s, and of course has picked up further to nearer 8% in the 2000s. Normally when that kind of economic growth acceleration takes place, you also have urban growth acceleration, and the opposite has happened in India. So what I take from that, there must be something missing or something wrong in our cities, in the way we have structured our cities, in the kind of employment opportunities appearing in cities, that urbanization has not expanded. And that's an issue of great importance because if we want rural productivity to increase, if we want average rural incomes to go up, then in fact people have to be shifted. I shouldn't say have to be shifted, people have to shift from rural to urban pursuits. The key difference between most of the Asian countries and Asian cities is the lack of growth in manufacturing. Even in the value added growth is lower than the service sector growth, which is very unusual. And manufacturing employment growth is even worse. In fact, there's very little manufacturing employment growth in the last 30 years. And to my mind, that's among the key reasons for the slower urbanization. And therefore, I'm glad to see that the government is now coming out with some kind of national manufacturing policy. But as part of that policy, there has to be, or there ought to be, a very explicit recognition that we need to take account and we need to take advantage of all the benefits that come from being in cities in terms of agglomeration economies, etc. We need to have a strong policy for encouraging industry to come up in cities, and of course taking care of all the environmental issues, etc. I think one of the encouraging things now is that there is greater interest in this issue. So you have two recent reports, one by McKinsey and the other by the high-powered committee on urban infrastructure, led by Dr. Mrs. Ishara Walia. And both of them have come up with different estimates for the kind of infrastructure investment needed. One striking thing in both reports is that almost just about only 10% or thereabouts of the total investment that they have estimated that is needed, you can cover all requirements for 24/7 water, sanitation, and storage. And to my mind, one of the best things you can do to Indian cities in terms of infrastructure is really to concentrate on that. Second, they have made very large estimates on transport, urban transport. They look a bit too high to me. And what is also interesting is the huge, very large differences between those two reports in terms of the composition of urban transport investment. The McKinsey report has estimated a large investment requirement for mass rapid transit. The estimate being done by the Arwale report is much lower for mass rapid transit and much higher for roads, urban road investment. The committee that I'm heading now, the National Committee on Transport Development Policy, our work is in process. The indication from the Urban Transport Working Group is that their estimate would be lower than both of these estimates. One of the key issues really is that the way that we structure the governance of our cities, you have a reasonably high degree of confusion in the institutional structure. This is not unusual if you look at even many other countries, that that what you do find is a whole host of institutions that have something to do with the running of cities, from municipal governments to utility providers to development authorities, etc. And we have all of them. I think we do need some better clarity in that. But even more importantly, the way things have run over the many years, 50, 60, 100 years even, that there's no prestige attached to working either for a municipal government, for a development authority or a local utility, and obviously the best minds are not going to these activities. So we really do need to give a lot of thought on how we can attract best minds to running our cities, to planning our cities, to maintaining them, to provide public services, and also to convince the analytically minded to do more research on these areas, that people ought to perhaps be excited about the possibility of working on these areas. It's very complex. You have what in some sense interesting is that you have really now hundreds of institutions that call themselves management institutes in the country, and there are lots of students clamoring to get into these institutions, but you don't have any which really focus on urban management, urban financing, urban governance, urban transport, and so on. And therefore, looking at this, the way the supply response has taken place on management institutions, one can imagine that if there was a demand for students to come out of urban management institutions or urban transport institutions, etc., that supply would be forthcoming. And so I think this is a big challenge, that we do something so that the urban institutions, whether they are municipal governments or development authorities, public utilities, are attractive enough for people to think of joining them for their careers. I think that many of us who 3 years back started thinking of IIHS, this was indeed the key issue in our minds, that just as the Indian Institutes of Technology, the Indian Institutes of Management, the national law schools were set up and have been very successful in A, attracting the best minds in the country, and B, then over a long period of time, like 30, 40 years, that these institutions have been very effective in providing a whole cadre of people who provided management talent, technology talent, law talent now in the last 10 years from the national law schools, that if you establish a similar place institution, the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, that hopefully over a period of time we can also be as effective as they have been in A, attracting some of the best minds in the country to come into this area, and B, then placing them in positions that will ultimately be influential in shaping the course of urbanization and the management of our cities. One way that I look at the interdisciplinarity is that my own professional development, that after getting my PhD, I worked exclusively for 4 years on studying one city, that is city of Bogota, and also city of Cali in Colombia. And because in that city we looked at all aspects of the city, that is the urban transport arrangements in Bogota, the financing of Bogota, the management of Bogota, the urban land policies in Bogota, urban land structure, urban land prices, the structure of the city in terms of densities and land values. I already mentioned urban transport. So just because I worked on that particular study, even though within a city, that in fact I got trained through the process of doing that research, also urban labor markets, income distribution, poverty distribution across the city, that I got trained in almost all areas. And I then, in my later career, I could work on on infrastructure as a whole. I worked on macro finance, that is the finance ministry looking at the macro issues of the country. That so working on a city lends itself to interdisciplinary work, because obviously all of these issues are cross-cutting, and so in that sense any institution which would want to educate and train people to understand the process of urbanization, to understand how cities ought to be planned, how they ought to be run, and so on, that it has to be interdisciplinary by definition. If you want exciting work, if you want challenging work, if you want intellectually stimulating work, this is the area that you need to come in, but you have to create those jobs. And the way that urbanization is continuing and the greater interest that is being taken by the government through programs like GNURM, and etc., that the likelihood in fact of spaces opening up for them would actually come up quite fast. So I think that I would say, look, you need, if you want an exciting life, this is the area you should come into it.